You know how your son looks at you when he thinks you don't notice. That quick glance, the kind that carries everything he's decided about you without ever saying it out loud. I'd been seeing that look for the better part of 3 years before he finally just came out and said what everyone in my family had apparently agreed on long before that afternoon. We were sitting at the kitchen table. My wife had made coffee she knew I wouldn't drink because she always made it too weak, and I never said anything because I'd learned a long time ago that some battles aren't worth starting. My son was home for the weekend. He and his fiancée were deep into wedding planning, spreadsheets, and vendor calls, and all of it. And I remember thinking he looked tired in the way young people look tired when they're carrying stress they chose for themselves. The good kind of tired. I didn't say that either. He wrapped his hands around his mug and looked at the table first, then at my wife, then at me. "Dad," he said, "we've been talking about the wedding, about the reception." I told him I was listening. Stephanie's family is going to be there. Her father is, you know who he is. Her uncles. These are people who they run in a certain world, and we want everything to go smoothly. I told him I understood that. "The thing is," he said, and he paused, and my wife put her hand flat on the table like she was bracing something. "We don't want you to give a speech." I looked at him. "It's not that we don't want you there," he said quickly. "Obviously you're going to be there. You're my father. But the toasts, we've got it handled. My best man, Stephanie's maid of honor, her father. It's going to be a full program already. We just think it's cleaner if you just enjoy the evening, you know, without the pressure of having to prepare something." My wife said, "It makes sense, Howard. You know how you get in front of people." I asked her how I get in front of people. She looked at the table. My son said, "You tend to go long, and sometimes the things you find interesting, they're not always what the room is interested in. It's just, this is our day, and we want it to flow." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the bushes, that high, sharp yapping that goes on longer than it should. "Okay," I said. My son looked relieved in a way that told me he'd been dreading this conversation. He reached over and gave my arm a squeeze, the kind that's meant to be reassuring but mostly just confirms that you were just told something disappointing. "It's going to be a great day, Dad. We just need it to go right," I said, of course. I told him it was going to be wonderful. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already written the speech. 8 minutes, 3 pages, double-spaced. I'd been working on it for 2 months. I'd practiced it walking the back fence line at dusk so the neighbors wouldn't hear me talking to myself. I had a story about the day he was born during a snowstorm, and I drove 40 miles on roads that hadn't been plowed because the hospital in our town was having a heating issue. I had a line I was proud of. Something about how watching your child walk toward the person they've chosen is the only moment in life that makes you feel like everything you did, all of it, the good and the embarrassing and the quiet and the loud, was pointing somewhere worth pointing. I deleted the file that night. Didn't move it to trash, just deleted it. That was 14 months before the wedding. I want to be fair here, because I've had a long time to think about this, and I don't believe in making villains out of people who are just afraid of things. My son is not a bad man. He's a man who grew up watching his father take up space in ways that made him uncomfortable, not because I was cruel or reckless, but because I was, apparently, intense. I talked too much at dinner parties. I had opinions about things other people had agreed to have no opinions about. I asked follow-up questions when the conversation had already moved on. My wife used to call it endearing when we were first married. Somewhere in the last decade, it became a liability. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for a mid-size firm in Columbus. The kind of work that nobody talks about at cocktail parties, but that holds up the buildings people are standing in while they have the cocktail parties. I retired 4 years ago on good terms, a decent pension, and a handshake from a managing partner who told me I'd always been one of the most technically precise people he'd ever worked with. He said it like a compliment. I took it like one. My wife and I have 2 children. My son, Daniel, is 34. He works in financial consulting in Chicago. My daughter, Lisa, is 31. She lives in Portland, teaches high school chemistry, and calls me every Sunday without fail. She is the one in my family who has always treated my talking as something other than a problem to manage. For most of my marriage, I was present, but peripheral. That is the most honest way I know to describe it. I was there at dinner, at recitals, at Little League games, at graduations, but I was there the way a piece of furniture is there, functional, expected, not particularly noticed unless it was out of place. I don't say this to generate sympathy. I'm trying to be accurate. After I retired, the peripheralness got louder somehow. My wife had her routines, the book club, the garden, her sister who came to visit 3 weeks every fall. My son had his life in Chicago. My daughter had Portland. And I had the house and the back fence and 31 years of knowing how buildings stay standing, which is not a skill that generates much conversation at the dinner table. I started a project about 8 months before my son told me not to give a speech. It began as something I was doing just to stay sharp. I'd always had a theory about load distribution in older residential construction, the kind of wood frame houses built in the Midwest between 1945 and 1975, specifically about how the standard approach to retrofitting them for seismic tolerance was inefficient in a way that could be corrected with a relatively simple recalibration of anchor points. It sounds dry. It is dry, but there's a kind of beauty in it if you've spent your life thinking in those terms. The way a redundant joint solves a problem that's been sitting in the wall for 60 years without anyone noticing. I started writing it down. Then I started modeling it. I had old software on my laptop that my former firm had licensed to me as a retirement courtesy, and I would sit in the spare bedroom, the one my wife used to call the home office, before she turned it mostly into a craft room at the corner desk, from about 9 at night until sometimes 2 in the morning, and I would work. My wife would look in occasionally. She never asked what I was doing. She would stand in the doorway, and I would hear her standing there, and then I would hear her go back down the hall. Once, about 4 months in, she said, "You're still at that computer thing." I told her I was working on something. She said, "You're retired, Howard." I told her I knew that. She said good night. My son's wedding was in June. By April, I had something that I didn't entirely know what to do with. The retrofit methodology had evolved into something more comprehensive, a system, really, a full proprietary approach that addressed not just the seismic issue, but a linked set of problems in residential structural reinforcement that I'd been watching the industry half solve for 2 decades. I'd documented it carefully. I had 340 pages of technical writing, diagrams, and modeling data. I had done this the right way, everything on my own time, on my own equipment, completely separate from anything that had ever touched my former employer. I want to be clear about that because I've heard what happens when people don't separate those things clearly, and I am a precise man. I didn't know what to do with it, because I am a structural engineer, not a businessman, and the distance between having a system that works and doing something with it is a distance full of lawyers and licensing agreements and people who speak a language I don't speak natively. There was a man I'd known for about 6 years named Marcus Webb. We'd met at a continuing education conference in Cincinnati before I retired, and we'd stayed in loose contact, the occasional email, a phone call once or twice a year. Marcus had spent the first half of his career in structural engineering and the second half in intellectual property consulting, specifically in the construction sector. He was not a friend exactly, more like the kind of acquaintance you trust in a specific lane because they've earned that trust through years of saying useful things. I sent him an email in April. I said I had something I'd been developing and I wanted a second set of eyes on it before I decided what to do. I asked if he had time. He called me the next morning. I walked him through the documentation over about 3 hours on a Tuesday. He asked questions, good ones, precise ones, the kind that told me he was actually reading and not just skimming. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "Howard, how long have you been sitting on this?" I told him about 8 months of active development. He said, "Who else has seen this?" I told him no one. He was quiet again. Then he said, "This is legitimate. I want to be careful about throwing numbers around before we've done the proper work, but I need you to understand that what you've built here is not a small thing." I told him I thought it was solid, but I didn't know the commercial side. He said, The commercial side is my problem. You just need to let me make some calls. I told him I'd appreciate that. I didn't tell my wife. I want to be honest about why. I had told her things before, smaller professional things, ideas I was excited about, and I had watched her be polite in the way that's worse than disinterest because it requires effort to maintain. I didn't want to watch her be polite about this. I wanted to know first whether it amounted to anything. It felt like the fair way to handle it. My son's wedding was June 14th. The week before, my daughter flew in from Portland and stayed with us. Lisa is the kind of person who fills a house. Without overwhelming it, she laughs at the right times. She asks questions she actually wants the answers to, and she has the rare quality of being able to sit in a room with someone who's being quiet and not make the quiet into something that needs to be fixed. She slept in the guest room and spent the mornings at the kitchen table with me while my wife was at her garden club, and we drank coffee the right strength because Lisa made it, and we talked about her students, about Portland, about whether the marriage between my son and his fiancée was going to hold up over time. She said, "I think Stephanie is good for him. She's calming." I said that was probably what he needed. She said, "Dad, did he tell you not to give a speech?" I told her yes. She put her mug down and looked at the table, and then she looked at me with an expression that her face has been making since she was about 9 years old, one that says she is deciding how honest to be. "That was wrong of him," she said. I told her he had his reasons. His reasons are that he's nervous and he doesn't always know how to say he loves you, so he manages you instead. She paused. "It's still wrong." I told her the wedding was going to be beautiful regardless. She said, "You don't have to be gracious about everything, you know." I told her I'd had a lot of practice. The wedding was at an estate venue outside of Columbus, the kind of place with a long gravel driveway and white tents and string lights and everything coordinated in a color palette that had been chosen by someone with a clipboard and a clear vision. Stephanie's family came down from Michigan. Her father was in commercial real estate, the kind of success that expresses itself in good shoes and controlled handshakes. He shook my hand at the rehearsal dinner and said it was nice to meet me. I got the impression he'd already filed me somewhere unremarkable in his assessment. I wore the suit my wife had picked out. I sat in the fourth row on the groom's side. I watched my son stand at the end of an aisle, lined with white flowers, and wait for his future wife. And he had an expression on his face I hadn't seen since he was very young, open, unguarded, genuinely moved by something. He looked the way people look when they're not thinking about how they look. I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't try to name. The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were the kind that had been written carefully and meant it. When the officiant said they were husband and wife, I heard my wife beside me make the small sound she makes when she's trying not to cry, and I found her hand and held it. And she let me. At the reception, my son gave a brief toast, thanking everyone for being there. His best man told a story that was funny in a way that didn't embarrass anyone. Stephanie's maid of honor cried in a way that was clearly genuine and made everyone in the room love her. Stephanie's father stood up and gave a 5-minute speech that was polished and warm and made 4 different references to the future grandchildren, and the room laughed each time. I sat at the family table, and I ate the salmon, and I watched my son dance with his wife, and I clapped when everyone clapped. Lisa sat next to me for most of the dinner. At one point she leaned over and said quietly, "The speech you would have given was better than all of those." I told her she didn't know that. She said, "I know you, Dad." Around 9:30 my wife went to join a cluster of her friends from the neighborhood who'd been invited as guests, and I found myself alone at the table for a while. The band was playing something from the 90s that I recognized but couldn't name. I watched the dance floor. I drank a glass of water. I checked my phone, and there was nothing urgent, and I put it face down on the tablecloth. That is when the evening turned into something I hadn't expected. My phone buzzed. I looked at it, assuming it was a social media notification or one of those group texts that starts with someone's name I don't immediately recognize, but it was Marcus. The text said, "Call me when you have a moment. Tonight if possible." I looked at the dance floor. My son was dancing with Stephanie, both of them laughing at something, her dress catching the string lights above them. My wife was across the room. The band was loud enough. I stepped outside through a side door that opened onto a stone terrace. The night was warm. the kind of June night that smells like cut grass and distance. I called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring. He said, "Are you somewhere you can talk?" I told him I was at my son's wedding reception. He said, "Congratulations. I'm sorry to call tonight." Then he said, "Howard, I need to tell you where things stand because it moved faster than I expected, and you deserve to know." I leaned against the stone railing and looked out at the dark lawn and the light coming from the tent behind me. He said he'd been in conversation with 3 firms over the past 6 weeks, 2 in structural reinforcement, 1 in construction materials technology. He said one of them had come in with a licensing offer that morning. He told me the number. I had to ask him to repeat it. He said it again. I stood on that terrace and looked at the dark lawn, and I did not say anything for what was probably 15 seconds. A burst of laughter came from inside the tent, the kind of collective laughter that means someone did something on the dance floor. The band kept playing. I said, "You're certain about the number?" He said, "It's a letter of intent. Nothing is signed yet." "But, Howard, I've done this work for 20 years. This number holds. There may be a counter. It could go higher." I said, "Marcus." He said, "I know." I said, "I was working on it in a craft room." He said, "The best things usually come from somewhere no one was watching." I stayed on that terrace for another few minutes after I hung up. The night was very quiet outside the ring of the tent. I could hear the faintest wind moving in the trees at the edge of the property. I thought about 31 years of work that nobody talked about at cocktail parties. I thought about the spare bedroom and the corner desk and the nights my wife looked in the doorway and went back down the hall. I thought about the speech I deleted. I went back inside. I found my daughter at the dessert table, and I stood next to her, and I said quietly, "Marcus called." She looked at me. She knows about Marcus because Lisa is the only person in my family I'd told about the project 3 months before on a Sunday call. She'd said, "Dad, that sounds genuinely important." Just like that. No performance of encouragement, just a statement. She said, "And?" I told her. She put down the piece of wedding cake she was holding. She turned and looked at me with an expression I've only seen on her face a handful of times in 31 years. The expression that means she is trying to hold something in that she'd prefer to let out. She said very quietly, "Oh, Dad." I told her nothing was signed yet. She said, "But it's real." I told her it appeared to be real. She hugged me then, right there at the dessert table, the kind of hug that is less about physical contact and more about saying something that doesn't have a word. I held on to her for a moment. The band was playing something slow. I looked across the room and found my son at the bar with his new father-in-law, both of them laughing, his hand at ease on the bar, the way confident men hold themselves in rooms they've decided they belong in. I thought, I love him completely and unconditionally, and tonight is his night, and I am not going to say a word. My wife and I drove home at 11:30. She was happy in the loosened way that comes from a glass and a half of champagne and a genuinely good evening, talking about Stephanie's dress and the centerpieces and the way her nephew had danced. I drove, and I listened, and I told her it had been a beautiful wedding. She said, "You did well tonight." I asked her what she meant. She said, "You were good, quiet. You let it be their night." I said, "Thank you." She fell asleep before we reached home. I want to tell you about the next 3 weeks because they're important to understanding what happened and why I made the choices I made. Marcus and I spent 2 weeks in what he called the negotiation phase. I talked to an intellectual property attorney named Sandra Okafor, who had been recommended by Marcus and who operated with a level of specificity that I respected immediately. She walked me through the licensing structure, the royalty provisions, the IP protections. She asked smart questions about my documentation and the timeline of development. She told me that the separation between my personal work and my former employer was clean and well established, which I had made sure of, but she was thorough about it. She said, "You've done this right, Mr. Calloway." I signed the licensing agreement on a Thursday morning in Sandra's office. Marcus was on the phone. Sandra slid the pages across the desk to me, and I read every line before I signed, which she said most people didn't do. I told her I was a structural engineer. She said she understood. The number held. It was a little higher than Marcus's first call. I did not tell my wife. I want to explain that because I know how it sounds. It sounds like concealment, like withholding, like the behavior of a man who is planning something. That is not what it was. I didn't tell her because I didn't know yet how to tell her in a way that would make sense, and because somewhere underneath the practical question of how to say it was a feeling I hadn't fully worked through yet, a feeling that had something to do with doorways and 2-week coffee, and being told that the way I existed in rooms was a problem that needed managing. I needed a little time with it, just a little time. The licensing firm filed the necessary documentation, and the story became public through an industry trade publication. First, a brief item about a new residential structural reinforcement methodology being licensed out of new residential trade. Columbus. It was a small notice. Most people don't read trade publications about structural engineering, except that one of Stephanie's uncles apparently did. He was a civil engineer himself, older, semi-retired, the kind of man who still gets the industry newsletters. He read the item on a Tuesday night. He looked at the name attached to the methodology. He said to his wife, "I think this is Daniel's father." His wife said, "The one at the wedding?" He said, "I think so." He picked up the phone and called Stephanie. Stephanie called my son. My son called me at 3:17 in the morning. I was awake. I had been awake, sitting in the spare bedroom at the corner desk, the way I'd sat there for the past 14 months. Except that now the project was done, and I was just sitting, reading something, one of those old engineering journals I'd kept since graduate school. The phone lit up on the desk with my son's name. I looked at it for one ring before I picked it up. I said, "Daniel." He said, "Dad?" His voice had something in it I hadn't heard in a long time, a stripped quality, like a surface that's had its finish taken off. "Dad, I'm looking at something on my phone, and I need you to, is this real? Is this you?" I told him I could explain. He said, "Is this real? Yes or no?" I told him yes. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to hear his breathing change. He said, "You've been working on this for how long?" I told him about 14 months, give or take, but the ideas had been in development longer than that. He said, We thought you were just." He stopped. I waited. He said, "Stephanie's uncle called her. She woke me up. Dad, his name is in this industry for 30 years, and he said this is significant, that the methodology is." He stopped again. He said it's going to change how residential retrofitting is done. I told him I had hoped it might. "Dad." His voice cracked, a small fracture, barely perceptible, the kind that takes years of practice to produce, and a lifetime of knowing someone to hear. "Dad, why didn't you tell us?" I said, "I wasn't sure what it was going to become, and I didn't want to have to explain it to people who had already decided what I was." He was quiet. I said, "That's not a reprimand, Daniel. I'm just answering your question honestly." He said, "I told you not to give a speech at my wedding." I told him I remembered. He said, "Because I thought you'd embarrass me." I said, "I know." He said, "Dad, I'm sorry. Dad, I'm so sorry." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the neighborhood was completely dark. 3 in the morning. That specific darkness that isn't threatening but is completely honest. The kind that has no performance in it. I said, "Your wedding was beautiful. You and Stephanie were beautiful. I wouldn't change anything about that day." He said, "That's not what I'm talking about." I said, "I know what you're talking about. I've been treating you like a problem," he said, and the directness of it surprised me, the willingness to just say it clearly. Maybe Stephanie is calming in the right direction. Maybe some things you don't have access to until 3 in the morning when the pretense is too expensive to maintain. For years, Dad. Not just the speech. All of it. The way we talked about you, the way Mom and I would. He stopped. "You were working on something that Stephanie's uncle, who has been in this industry since before I was born, is calling a major contribution. You were doing that while we thought you were just wasting time on a computer." I told him I hadn't been doing it to prove anything to anyone. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it worse." We stayed on the phone for a while after that. We didn't resolve everything. You don't resolve years of something in a 3 a.m. phone call, and I wasn't looking for a resolution. I was looking for honesty, and that was what the call was. His voice was tired and real, and it had nothing left in it to hide behind. Before I hung up, he said, "Can we come down next weekend? Stephanie and I. Can we just come down and have dinner?" I told him, of course. He said, "And Dad, I want to hear about it. All of it. The whole thing. How you built it. How long you worked on it. Everything." I told him I'd be glad to tell him. I sat in the spare bedroom for a while after I put the phone down. The house was quiet. Down the hall, I could hear my wife's measured breathing through the cracked door. The old journals were stacked on the corner of the desk where I'd stacked them years ago. The desk lamp had a warm yellow throw, and it lit the room in a way that made it look like a place where things had happened. Eventually, I heard my wife's breathing change, and then the sound of her sitting up, and then her footsteps down the hall. She appeared in the doorway in her robe, her hair down, and she looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who has just woken up to a version of the night they didn't expect. She said, "Was that Daniel?" I told her yes. She came and sat in the chair across from the desk, the one she used for her craft projects, and she looked at me, and I could see her deciding what kind of question to ask first. She said, "Howard, what's going on?" I told her there was something I'd been working on that I should have told her about sooner, and that I was sorry I'd waited as long as I had, and that I wanted to explain it properly. She looked at the journals, the desk, the laptop closed in the corner. She looked at me with the expression of a person who is looking back at 14 months of doorways they didn't walk through and questions they chose not to ask. She said, "Tell me." So I told her. All of it. The way it started as a theory I'd been carrying for years and how it developed into a system and how I'd contacted Marcus and what Sandra had said about the documentation and what the licensing agreement looked like and what the number was. When I said the number, she put her hand over her mouth. She sat with her hand over her mouth for a moment, and then she put it down and she said, "You were doing all of this. While I thought you were just..." I waited. She looked at the desk. She looked at the lamp. She looked at her hands. She said, "I've not been fair to you." I told her I understood that she'd had her own things. She said, "Howard, don't make it easier for me right now. I'm trying to say something." I told her I was listening. She said, "I've been treating you like someone who lost his usefulness when he stopped going to an office. Like the work was the point of you, and when the work stopped, the point stopped. And that was wrong. And I watched you in that room, night after night, and I didn't ask, because I didn't want to know what the answer would be." I said, "Why didn't you want to know?" She said, "Because if you were doing something real and I'd been writing it off as you not adjusting well to retirement, then I'd have to think about what that says about me." She paused, and it turns out I have to think about that anyway. We sat in the spare bedroom for a long time. The house was quiet around us, the deep, particular quiet of a house that has been a life inside it, that carries the decades in its walls and its floors and its doorways. I looked at my wife across the desk, in the yellow lamplight, and she looked back at me. I said, "I should have told you. I kept waiting until I knew it was real, and that was partly practical, and partly I paused. Partly I didn't want to watch you be polite about it if it turned out to be nothing." She said, "I've made you expect that." I told her that was an honest thing to say. She said, "I want to hear about the methodology. I don't understand any of it, probably, but I want you to explain it to me." I told her it was 3 a.m. She said, "I know what time it is. Tell me." So I told her about load distribution and anchor points, and the way a redundant joint can solve a problem that has been sitting in a wall for 60 years without anyone noticing. I pulled up the modeling diagrams on the laptop and turned it so she could see, and I walked her through it the way I would explain something to someone who was genuinely interested but didn't share the technical background. She asked questions. Some of them were surprisingly good. She sat forward in the craft chair with her robe pulled around her, and she looked at the screen, and she asked about the houses. What kind of houses? How old? And I told her, and she said, "So all those old houses in this neighborhood?" And I said, "Yes, exactly those kinds of houses." And she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in a long time. She said, "Howard, you built something." I told her I had. She said, "Something real?" I told her yes. She put her hand on the desk between us, not reaching for me, just placing it there, in the space. I put mine on top of it. The weekend, my son and Stephanie came to dinner. My daughter flew in from Portland. I hadn't asked her to. She called and said, "I'm coming down that weekend. Is that all right?" And I said, "Of course." She brought a bottle of wine that was better than what I would have bought, and she helped my wife with the kitchen in the way that Lisa moves through other people's spaces, efficiently and without taking over. My son arrived with Stephanie, and he came through the front door and he hugged me, the way men who have figured something out about themselves hug their fathers. Longer than usual. He stepped back and looked at me, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that the hug hadn't said. We sat around the kitchen table that night, all 5 of us, and I told the whole story from the beginning. I talked for a long time. No one told me I was going long. No one checked their phone. Stephanie's eyes went wide at certain points, and she asked good questions, technical ones, and she said, "My uncle wants to meet you, by the way, formally. He has a lot to say." I said I'd be glad to meet him. At one point, my wife said, "He worked on it every night for a year, and I never once asked him what he was doing." She said it matter-of-factly, not fishing for reassurance, just putting it on the table. My son looked at his plate. Then he said, "Neither did I." There was a moment of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just true. Lisa said, "Well, now we know." My son looked up at me and said, "That speech you would have given at the wedding?" I told him it didn't matter. He said, "I'd like to hear it sometime. If you remember any of it." I told him I'd deleted the file. He said, "Then tell me the story you were going to tell, the one from when I was born." So I told it. The snowstorm, and the 40 miles on unplowed roads, and the hospital with the heating issue, and the particular silence of the delivery room after you've been driving through a blizzard, and then suddenly everything is still, and the doctor says the words you've been waiting to hear, and you look down at this person who is entirely new to the world, and you think, this is what everything was pointing toward. My son listened without saying anything. When I finished, he looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up and he said, "That would have been a good speech, Dad." I told him I thought so too. Later that night, after my son and Stephanie had gone to the hotel and my daughter was asleep in the guest room, my wife and I sat on the back porch the way we used to sit years ago, before the distance installed itself between us so gradually we hadn't felt it happening. The neighborhood was dark and quiet. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler was running. The June air had that same warmth it carries late into the night when the summer is new. She said, "What happens now? With the licensing? With the money?" I told her the first payment came through the following month. I told her what we could do with it, and what I thought we should do with it. And she listened, and asked questions, and offered opinions. And for the first time in a long time, the conversation between us was the kind that goes somewhere. She said, "Are you going to keep working? Building other things?" I told her I thought I might. That there were 2 or 3 other problems I'd been turning over for years that might be worth developing properly. She said, "I'd like to know about them. From the beginning, this time." I told her I'd like that too. I looked out at the backyard, at the back fence line where I'd walked in the evenings practicing a speech I ultimately didn't give. The grass needed cutting. The old oak in the corner had a branch that had come down in the spring and I hadn't gotten to it yet. Everything was familiar and ordinary and exactly the same as it had always been. And underneath that sameness, something had shifted in a way I was still adjusting to. At 63 years old, I had built something in a spare bedroom that was worth more than 3 decades of going to an office. I had not told anyone while I built it, not because I was hiding anything, but because I had spent enough years watching the people who were supposed to know me choose not to notice. I don't believe in dramatic conclusions. I don't believe the money changed anything fundamental about who we are to each other. My son still has reflexes he learned over decades that will resurface occasionally. My wife and I will have evenings where the old distances reappear. Families don't resolve themselves. They adjust. They recalibrate. They find better configurations that still carry the weight of what came before. But that night on the back porch, with the sprinkler running down the block, and the June air warm and my wife beside me asking about what I was going to build next, I felt something I want to be careful about naming because I don't want to be melodramatic about it. I felt noticed. Not because of the number Marcus had told me on the phone, not because Stephanie's uncle wanted to meet me, not because my son's voice had cracked at 3 in the morning, because my wife had sat in the craft chair at 2 in the morning and asked me to explain load distribution to her, and she had leaned forward, and she had listened. I had been working in that room for 14 months without anyone asking what I was doing. Now someone was asking. I picked up my glass. The night was quiet. The oak tree in the corner caught a little wind and moved. Maybe things change, and maybe they don't. I've been around long enough to know that the moments you think are turning points sometimes aren't, and the ones that actually matter are usually the ones that happen at kitchen tables and on back porches, and in spare bedrooms at 2 in the morning when everyone has stopped performing. What I know is this. I smiled and I set the glass down and I told her about the second problem I'd been turning over, the one about thermal bridging and pre-70s construction, and she pulled her knees up to her chest in the porch chair the way she used to do when we were young, and she said, "Okay, start from the beginning." And I did.